Have you ever been completely, utterly wrong about someone? I mean, the kind of wrong that doesn't just make you blush with embarrassment, but the kind that changes you, that haunts you in the quiet moments, forcing you to question everything you thought you knew about the world. This is a story about a storm, a plane, and the most unlikely hero you could ever imagine. Picture this. A Boeing 747, a giant of the sky, is a tiny, fragile speck of light pushing through the pitch-black expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean. Inside, it's a world of its own. The cabin lights are dim. Most of the passengers are asleep, lulled by the constant, gentle hum of the engines. That familiar sound of modern travel, of everything working as it should. In seat 18B, in the economy section, a woman named Dr. Aliyah Khan is sleeping. At 35, she's learned to sleep anywhere, a skill forged in places where rest was a precious, rare commodity. She's dressed simply, comfortable jeans, a soft, worn-in blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. To anyone glancing her way, she was just another passenger, perhaps a doctor returning from a conference, or a visitor heading home to family. She was ordinary, invisible even. A few rows up, in the plush, spacious world of first class, sat Marcus Thorne, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He was sipping a glass of expensive whiskey, the ice cubes clinking softly. He was a man who was used to things going his way. A man who believed his wealth and status were a direct reflection of his intelligence and capability. He looked around the cabin with a sense of ownership, of belonging. This was his natural habitat. None of them knew that in a matter of minutes, every single one of their lives would hinge on a single, terrifying question. It started with a jolt, a sharp, violent shudder that ran through the entire fuselage. Then another. The gentle hum became an angry roar. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed urgently, but it was too late for that. This was different. This was the plane screaming in protest. And then, a voice cracked through the intercom. But it wasn't the calm, reassuring baritone of the captain they were used to. This voice was strained, tight with a fear so raw it was contagious. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot, Liam Carter. You could hear a pin drop. Every sleeping passenger was now wide awake. We have a serious situation. His voice trembled, breaking on the words. Captain Harris is unconscious. We have a medical emergency, and we are currently flying through an unforecast Category 5 storm system. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The plane dropped suddenly, a sickening lurch that sent stomachs into throats. Oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling, swinging like morbid pendulums. I am not. Liam's voice cracked again, and you could almost see the young man, terrified and alone in that cockpit. I am not qualified to fly this aircraft alone in these conditions. Is there anyone on board, anyone at all, with combat aviation experience? Please, I am asking for immediate assistance. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the turbulence. It was the silence of 312 people realizing, all at once, that they might be doomed. Panic, pure and simple, began to bloom. A child started wailing, a high, piercing sound of pure fear. A woman began to pray aloud, her words a frantic, desperate whisper. Men fumbled for their phones, their faces pale as they typed out messages they prayed wouldn't be their last. The cozy, insulated world of the airplane had vanished, replaced by a metal tube of sheer, unadulterated terror. It was in this chaos that Marcus Thorne decided to be the hero. He unclipped his seatbelt and stood up, steadying himself against a headrest. "Listen," he yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. He wasn't talking to the passengers. He was yelling toward the closed cockpit door. "My name is Marcus Thorne. My cousin is a private pilot. I've flown with him dozens of times over the Alps. I know the procedures. I can help." A flight attendant, her own hands shaking, rushed over to him. "Sir, please, we need someone with specific military training. The controls, the conditions, civilian experience isn't enough for this." Marcus's face flushed with indignation. Was she doubting him? Him? "Are you questioning me?" he sputtered, his chest puffing out. "I paid $15,000 for this seat. I think I have more relevant experience than anyone else back here." His gaze swept dismissively over the economy cabin, over the crying children and the praying women, over the sleeping figure in 18B. But seat 18B was now empty. All eyes turned to the aisle. There, walking with a calm, deliberate grace that seemed to defy the plane's violent shaking, was Dr. Aaliyah Khan. The turbulence that had everyone else gripping their armrests seemed to barely affect her. Her movements were fluid, economical. She wasn't frantic. She was focused. She approached the flight attendant, her voice low and steady, a complete contrast to the screaming wind and the crying passengers. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority. "My name is Dr. Aaliyah Khan, former Major, United States Air Force. I have 600 hours of flight time in F-35 fighter jets, with specialized training in extreme weather evasion and emergency navigation." The silence that fell was absolute. It was as if someone had hit a mute button on the entire world. The only sound was the relentless hammering of the storm. Marcus Thorne was the first to break it. He let out a short, sharp, bitter laugh, a sound of pure disbelief. "You," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You've got to be kidding me." He looked her up and down, taking in her simple clothes, her calm demeanor. "Look, I respect our troops, I really do. But I'm not going to bet my life on some fantasy." Other passengers began to murmur. An elderly man in a first-class seat leaned over to his wife. "Is she for real? She looks so young." The unspoken words hung in the air. Asterisk, "She doesn't look like a pilot. She doesn't look like a hero." Asterisk. Just then, the cockpit door swung open. Co-pilot Liam Carter stood there, his face as white as the uniform shirt he was wearing. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, and his eyes were wide with sheer terror. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Is there anyone? Captain Mitchell's condition is worsening. I've never flown solo in anything like this. I can't do this alone." Marcus stepped forward again, seizing the moment. "Son, listen to me. I have over 200 hours of experience in the air. I know what I'm doing." But Liam's eyes weren't on Marcus. They were locked on Aaliyah. He saw something in her eyes that he desperately needed to see. Not panic, not arrogance, but a deep, unshakable calm. The calm of someone who has stared into the abyss before and didn't blink. Aaliyah turned her gaze from Liam to Marcus. She didn't look angry. She looked resolved. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice still quiet, but now it seemed to fill the entire cabin. "There are three kinds of pilots in this world. Those who fly when it's easy. Those who fly when it's hard." She paused, and the plane gave another violent shudder, as if to emphasize her point. "And those who fly when it's impossible." She took a step toward the cockpit, then stopped, turning back to him one last time. "During my career," she said, her eyes holding his, "I have saved 17 aircraft in situations the manuals said were unrecoverable. But what qualifies me for this moment isn't my medals or my flight hours." The plane dove again, and she didn't even sway, her balance perfect. What qualifies me is that I am the only person on this plane who has ever flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a destroyed navigation system, and missiles being fired at my aircraft. And I still brought my entire crew home safely. She gave a small, firm nod to Liam Carter. The cockpit is mine. And as she moved to step inside, she delivered the final, devastating blow to Marcus Thorne's crumbling worldview. She looked him dead in the eye. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "when we reach the ground, and we will reach the ground, perhaps you'll reflect on how a woman who, in your eyes, didn't belong in first class, saved your life and the lives of your family." And with that, she disappeared into the cockpit. The door closed with a soft, final click. The passengers were left in a stunned silence. The storm still raged outside, but inside, a different kind of tempest was brewing. One of shame, of shock, of dawning, horrible realization. Marcus Thorne stood frozen in the aisle, his mouth agape. The arrogant, confident businessman was gone, replaced by a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been dismantled. He had been so sure, so utterly, completely sure. And in that moment, as the Boeing 747 continued to be tossed around the sky like a toy, a single, terrifying question echoed in every mind, but most of all in Marcus's. What have we just done? The click of that cockpit door closing was the loudest sound Marcus Thorne had ever heard. It was the sound of his own judgment slamming shut. The plane gave another violent shudder, but this time, the tremor that ran through Marcus had nothing to do with turbulence. Inside the cockpit, a different world awaited Alia Khan. It was a scene of controlled chaos, lit by the frantic, glowing reds and ambers of emergency panels. Captain Harris was slumped in his seat, his body seizing, a thin line of foam at the corner of his mouth. The heart monitor beside him screeched a relentless, panicked alarm. Co-pilot Liam Carter was frozen, his hands hovering over the controls, his knuckles white. He was a deer in the headlights of an onrushing train. I don't know. The manual says," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly across a dozen screaming instruments. Alia didn't hesitate. She moved with a surgeon's precision, her voice cutting through the noise, calm and clear. "James, first aid kit. Now, I need you to monitor his airway." Her commands were not requests. She checked the captain's pulse, her fingers firm and sure on his wrist. "He's stable for now, but we have about 15 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes a real risk." Liam watched, mesmerized, as she simultaneously adjusted flight controls with her other hand. "Colonel, how do you know all this? The medicine?" 10 years flying rescue missions in hostile territory," she replied, her eyes never leaving the storm radar, which showed a swirling mass of angry red and yellow. "When you're the only thing between a wounded soldier and death, you learn." Back in the cabin, Marcus finally sank back into his seat, the fight gone out of him. The other passengers avoided his gaze. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had deemed unworthy, was now their only hope. The irony was a bitter pill he could already feel stuck in his throat. But old habits die hard. As the plane entered a period of relative calm, his fear began to morph back into a twisted form of pride. "This is madness," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "She's flying on a prayer. We're all going to die because of some quota." It was then that a quiet, authoritative voice spoke from across the aisle. "Mr. Thorne, that's enough." It was Dr. Elena Rossi, a woman who had been reading a medical journal for the entire flight. She closed it slowly and looked at him, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "I am the chief of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. For 3 years, I worked in military hospitals. I have treated pilots who have ejected, who have crashed, who have endured G-forces that would break you. I have seen that look in Colonel Khan's eyes before. It is not the look of an imposter. It is the look of someone who has already faced death and won. I suggest you sit down, be quiet, and trust her. Marcus opened his mouth to retort, but found he had no words. The respect in Dr. Rossi's voice was undeniable. Inside the cockpit, Aaliyah was performing calculations that made Liam's head spin. She was scribbling vectors and angles on a notepad, flying through the storm in her mind before attempting it with the plane. "Colonel," Liam said, his voice tight with fear. "That trajectory, it goes against every safety protocol. We're supposed to go around a storm cell this size, not through it." Aaliyah allowed herself a small, grim smile. "Liam, in 2019, I was leading a mission when our plane was hit. 2 engines gone, navigation destroyed, 0 visibility. The manual said to eject, but there were 17 wounded soldiers on board depending on us." She began to gently bank the massive aircraft, her movements fluid and confident. "So I did what I'm doing now. I threw the manual out the window and trusted my experience. And I brought every single one of them home. All 17. Her words hung in the air, not as a boast, but as a simple, staggering statement of fact. Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. He was not in the presence of a good pilot. He was in the presence of a legend. Suddenly, the cockpit door burst open. Marcus stood there, his face a mask of frantic desperation. "I demand to speak to air traffic control. This is collective suicide. I have a right." "Mr. Thorne," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice cold as steel. She didn't even turn to look at him. "This cockpit is not a democracy. It is a command post. Get out." But Marcus was beyond reason. "You're a fraud. I want to see your credentials." It was then that Aaliyah did something that would silence him forever. Without taking her hands from the controls, she nodded to Liam. "James, military frequency 121.5. Now." Liam switched the radio. "Andrews Air Force Base. This is Global 447, requesting identity confirmation for a civil emergency." The response was instantaneous, a voice crackling with shock and recognition. *Global 447, this is Andrews. Is that Spectre? Colonel Khan? We've lost your transponder. The entire Air Force is on alert looking for you. The blood drained from Marcus's face. Spectre. It was a call sign, whispered with reverence. "Andrews, this is Colonel Khan," Aaliyah said, her voice steady as a rock. "We have a dual emergency. Captain incapacitated, flying blind through an unpredicted supercell. Requesting emergency landing coordinates and priority clearance. Spectre, you have top priority. Repeat, top priority. All East Coast airspace is being cleared for you. Emergency crews are being scrambled to Baltimore International. Godspeed, Spectre. The radio fell silent. Dr. Rossi, who had followed Marcus to the door, gave him a look of pure, unvarnished pity. "Do many tourists have the United States Air Force clear the entire eastern seaboard for them, Mr. Thorne?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply backed away from the door, his legs weak, and stumbled back to his seat. The final, fragile pillar of his arrogance had crumbled to dust. He had underestimated her, judged her, and tried to destroy her credibility. And in return, she had revealed she was a person of such immense importance that a nation's military mobilized at the sound of her name. The next 15 minutes were a blur of controlled terror. Aaliyah guided the massive 747 into a spiraling descent, riding a column of turbulent but navigable air in the storm's very heart. The plane groaned and shuddered, But it held. Passengers screamed, cried, and prayed, but through the cockpit door, they could hear Aaliyah's voice, calm, steady, issuing commands with an authority that was somehow comforting. "Easy now, James. Watch our vertical speed. That's it. Baltimore Tower. This is Spectre on final approach. Runway is in sight." The landing was not gentle. It was a hard, firm meeting of metal and concrete. A screeching, shuddering reunion with the earth that was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. The plane slowed, surrounded by foam and flashing emergency vehicle lights. They were down. They were safe. A silence more profound than any that had come before filled the cabin. And then, it was broken by the sound of one person clapping. Then another. And then, the entire cabin erupted into a thunderous, tear-filled ovation. The story of the unseen commander didn't end on that rain-swept runway. For Aaliyah Khan, it was a new beginning. 6 months later, she was promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony at the Pentagon, the youngest woman of her background to ever achieve the rank. The Khan spiral descent was incorporated into advanced flight manuals. She became a symbol, not just of heroism, but of quiet competence in the face of arrogant noise. She never spoke of Marcus Thorne publicly. Her success was her statement. For Marcus, the landing was just the beginning of a long, hard fall. A passenger's recording of his prejudiced tirade found its way online. It went viral. The hashtag #NotMyPilot trended. His business, built on a facade of savvy and reliability, collapsed. Clients abandoned him. Within a year, he was filing for bankruptcy. The final blow came from his own family. His wife, Victoria, looked at the man on the video and saw a stranger. "I married a man I thought was successful," she told him during divorce proceedings. "I discovered I was living with a man who thought privilege was a substitute for character." She left, taking their children with her. Months later, a humbled Marcus, now working a modest job, found himself in a crowded airport terminal. And there she was, Brigadier General Aaliyah Khan, wearing a service dress blue uniform adorned with ribbons, surrounded by aides. She was the picture of respect, of earned authority. He was in a cheap suit, carrying a small wheeled suitcase. He watched her for a moment, gathering what little courage he had left. He approached, his steps hesitant. "General Khan?" he said, his voice soft. She turned. For a second, there was no recognition in her eyes. Then a flicker. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone neutral, not unkind. I just wanted to apologize," he stammered, "for everything I said on that flight. She studied him, not with anger, but with a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. "Mr. Thorne," she said, cutting him off gently, "you gave me the greatest gift possible that day." He was stunned. "A gift? How?" "You reminded me why I do what I do," she said. "Every person I save, every barrier I break, every young person I inspire to look past what others think of them. It's all possible because there are still people like you in the world. You motivated me to prove you wrong." He nodded, swallowing the hard, painful lump in his throat. "I lost everything," he whispered. "No," she corrected him, her voice firm yet not cruel. "You discovered you never had anything real to lose. Privilege is not achievement. Respect is not inherited. And competence," she said, her eyes holding his for one last, searing moment. "Competence never cares what you look like." She gave a slight professional nod, then turned and walked away, her team closing ranks around her. Marcus stood there, alone in the middle of the bustling terminal, as the truth of her words settled over him. He had been so busy judging the cover, he never bothered to read the story. And what a story it was! Aaliyah's true victory wasn't in humiliating him. It was in rendering his prejudice irrelevant. It was in building a legacy so brilliant that it outshone his small-mindedness. She had shown him that the strongest revenge isn't getting even. It's rising so high that the people who doubted you eventually have to look up just to see how far they've fallen. And in the end, that is the most powerful lesson of all.